Hello, everyone. We're on the air. This is Dr. Alexander Rosenthal, once again, of the Petrarch Institute. Um, and I'm here with co-founder Miles Smith. You want to say hello, Miles?
Hello, everyone. It's great to have you with us again for another one of our videos. We got the idea from some of the ones that were more popular that it might possibly be of interest for you that we would do a video talking a little bit about the Byzantine Empire of yore. But before we get into that, Alice, you may want to say what we're going to cover today, but did you also want to tell them about our courses, which are a really substantial, good fleshing out of what we cover, at least in the superficial way here in the videos?
So it's just important for everybody to know that in addition to the videos that we're putting up on topics which are often germane to the classical tradition, we also have courses which allow us to go much more in depth into various topics. So we've had one on the classical virtue tradition, which will be offered continually. We have a most recent one on rhetoric. We've done one on Nietzsche and Socrates. So I just want to let everybody know that at very affordable prices, you also have the opportunity to really go in depth into some of these topics. So if you find these videos interesting, I would strongly urge you to strongly consider our courses. And I put my email up on this video if anybody wants to contact me for more information on that. So what shall we do today, Miles? We'll discuss a little bit about what we're going to do with regard to the Byzantine Empire.
Yeah, it was my understanding, and I think it's a really smart idea that we would do it in two parts, as you suggested. And I think your idea was that in the first part, we would really give people a sense of what this thing, which they know from art, which they read about in poetry, which they hear about from historians, and which they understand as a kind of object of historical reverie and memory. What was that thing? To talk a little bit about its nature and its constitution. And then I guess also it had a very long history. And your thought was that in this first video of two, we could cover the front end of that history from its inception under the Roman Empire. Is that about right?
Well, yes, that's absolutely right. So I mean, in terms of subject matter, we're basically, this time we're going to discuss the politics and early history of the Byzantine Empire up to the end of the Isaurian dynasty, which takes us, let's say, from Constantine, who around 312 AD, to the end of the Isaurians at about 802 AD. So we're limiting it temporally that way, just to make the subject manageable, and also to give you a sense of the foundations of this civilization. This week we'll do the politics and early history, early political history. And the next session, part two, we're going to cover religion and culture, which are also, I think, very interesting, in some ways, perhaps even more core to understanding the Byzantine Empire. So let's start with part one. So the first question, and Miles sort of alluded to it, is this question of what is the Byzantine Empire? The first thing to understand is that well, in Western historiography, since at least the Renaissance, this idea of the fall of the Roman Empire has been an endless topic of fascination. Why did this, the greatest and mightiest of the classical empires, which had this thriving urban civilization, which brought literate urban culture to Western Europe, right? Why did this civilization collapse? But what has often been forgotten or has not received the same emphasis is that only the Western Roman Empire collapsed, right? So nobody in the Byzantine Empire self-consciously thought of themselves as a Byzantine. It's a bit of a historiographical construct. The Byzantines thought of themselves as the Basilia ton Romeon, right? The empire or kingdom of the Romans, right? It was simply the Eastern continuation of the old Roman Empire. And in fact, in many respects, many of the elements of the old Roman Empire continued on as before. You had the preservation of urban life. You had the preservation of classical education, the classical forms of humanitas or paideia, right? You had a flourishing trade in luxuries, right, with the Middle East, and so in many senses, right, there was no sharp break between the Eastern Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire and the Old Roman Empire. But there are, I think, a number of reasons to talk about it as a distinctive civilization as well. What are the distinctive elements of it? Here I would just mention a few things. The first and most obvious is the fact that this empire was centered in Constantinople, right? It did not include Rome, right? And so in that sense, it was the Byzantine Empire in the literal sense that that it was centered in the East, in this city of Constantinople. Whereas the Latin civilization, the culture of Latin Rome continued as Latin Christendom in the Middle Ages, in the western part of Europe. So that's one thing. Another thing is that culturally speaking, we can consider, I mean, I would make the argument that in some ways we can think about the Byzantine culture, and increasingly so, as more of the heir to the Hellenistic culture, which Alexander the Great had established when he brought Greek culture to the Middle East, right? I mean, Alexander's idea was this idea of the marriage of East and West. And so you had in the Eastern Mediterranean and Greece and Anatolia, right, in that whole region, this Hellenistic culture, which was in some respects, which was kind of fusionist culture, in some respects Greek, but also taking on elements of what the classical world would think of as Asia. Things like the ideas of sacred monarchy and elaborate court ritual and these various elements that might have been more associated with, say, something like the Persian Empire than the Greek polis. And I think we'll see with the Byzantines some of these elements. It's a kind of crossroads civilization, crossing, let's say, the Eastern, the Greek, let's say, the Greek part of Europe, as well as what we would now call the Middle East, right? So it's kind of a crossroads empire. The third element is that it was, and particularly after the Emperor Heraclius, an almost exclusively Greek empire. Now, during the Roman Empire was always a bilingual empire. So you had the Latin West and the Greek-speaking East. The Romans never succeeded nor really tried to uproot the Hellenic culture of the eastern part of their empire. But it was bilingual, at least among elites, right? Someone like Cicero would have been familiar with Greeks, Roman elites in the West, and the same would be true of the earlier Byzantine emperors. They would have been familiar with Latin. Gradually, that sort of ceases, right? So Greek is largely forgotten within Latin Christendom, and Latin is largely forgotten within the Byzantine Empire. So you have, or at least not much used. So you have this it's linguistically a Greek culture rather than a Latin Roman culture. And the other thing would be the distinctive artistic and cultural forms, right? I think any layman can tell the difference between the mosaics of San Vitale in Ravenna or the Hagia Sophia in what is today Istanbul, was then Constantinople, and the Roman Pantheon, right? Or the temples of Jupiter, right? And this sort of thing, right? So there are unique cultural and artistic forms to this Byzantine culture, by which we could say that it had evolved into something quite distinctive. So depending on whether we want to emphasize the continuities or the discontinuities, we can come up with different interpretations of the Byzantine culture. But I think that was sort of important to mention as some of its distinctive elements. Before I move on to why should we study the Byzantine Empire? Why do we care? Did you have anything you wanted to add, Mas?
Just maybe some very uh, broad questions about this identity and the self-conception of the Byzantines. I mean, they really came into their own, I guess, from a time when the Roman Empire was beginning to be more Christian. And so I'm just wondering, in terms of value and confession and identity, is that an essential difference between the, the view from Constantinople, so to speak, as opposed to the view from Rome?
I'm going to discuss, yeah, I should mention that. Now, one thing I think I may have neglected to mention is also something pivotal about it would also be the fact that it became after 1054, there was a split between the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church, right? So after 1054, which goes somewhat beyond the time that we'll discuss, but nonetheless, we're going to see divergences already. It becomes the center of an Orthodox civilization, an Eastern Orthodox civilization. We're going to discuss, when I get to the political order, obviously one of the elements of the Byzantine Empire was the way in which it was completely suffused with Christian religious influence, right? I mean, almost the fusion of church and state, or very close, as they would call it, symphonia, right? Very close symphony between church and state, which comes from this Constantinian inheritance. I'll discuss that a little bit more about some of the differences between how the West tended to view the Constantinian settlement and how the East did. We'll discuss that in detail, but we should probably hold off a little bit because that'll start to get us into the details.
Maybe one other quick question is, you talked about this kind of weaving together of Hellenic culture and elements of Greek or Hellenic identity, including the use of language, and the Roman imperial tradition that really shaped how the Byzantines, and certainly the Byzantine ruling elite, saw themselves. Is there an element where geography comes into play? I mean, is there a sense in which, from early days or as time goes on, they are an Asian culture in a way that the Western half in Rome would have been a European culture, or does that distinction not help much?
Yeah, so that's, I guess, what I was trying to reach at by discussing the older Hellenistic culture that the Romans had conquered, right? So you think about the Greek polis, it was a citizen democracy or aristocracy, depending on the particular city-states, in which laws were made by the same people who were bound by them, right? There was no sharp distinction between ruler and subject in the early Greek understanding. Whereas what you saw in the Middle East, what they would call Asia, Persian Empire, right, were sort of god kings or kings who were backed by divine authority, sacred monarchies, right, where kings were believed to have basically religious justification or legitimation for their rule. And so already with Alexander, you have this fusion of, let's say, a Persian style monarchies after Alexander, right, with Greek culture. And I'm arguing, and many have seen this sort of thing as sort of continuing. And so what the Byzantines, I'm saying, are the heir to is the sort of fusionist Hellenistic, what's called the Hellenistic culture. But we should remember that the Roman Empire was a Mediterranean empire, which meant that Eastern and Western influences, as it were crossing all the time. I mean, Christianity itself, of course, has roots in Israel, right, which would be in the Middle East. And I think we'll see also there was a process of, what Christopher Dawson thinks of as sort of an orientalization of the empire in the late empire, right? So, but yes, the bottom line is yes. There is a sense in which the Byzantine Empire, by being in the crossroads, right? I mean, its neighbors are the Persian Empire and later Islam, right? Those are the neighbors. That's the world in which the Byzantine Empire inhabits, right? And so there is a sense in which it belongs to a certain degree politically to this world of the sort of sacred monarchy. So does that help?
It does, yeah. And I think, Alex, you've already done a pretty good job just with these teasers of explaining why we should study this and be familiar with it, because, you know, going into the 15th century, the history of Byzantium stretches into what we begin to think of as the early modern era. But I think people will be keen to hear your case for why we should really make Byzantium something we understand a bit better.
Yeah, so I would say four things about this subject of why study the Byzantine Empire. So first is the continuous and lingering influences of the Byzantine Empire on Western culture. And two that come to mind right away would be first the influence of the Justinian code, the legal code, right? So under Justinian, as we'll discuss, he codifies Roman law, the Corpus Juris Civilis, right? Probably the last important Latin work in the Byzantine world, in the Eastern world. And this becomes the foundation, basically, of all the systems of law that continue to be used in continental Europe, right? In other words, they're evolutions or developments from the codified Roman law, right? So other than Britain, which of course has its own common law system and history, right? So the civil law systems of Europe, we could say that the Byzantines laid one of the most important foundation stones. A second would be when we look at the Renaissance and the revival of Greek learning in Italy, right, which is sort of the transition from the medieval to the modern era. Byzantine scholars moving to Italy as the Byzantine Empire is breathing its last, right, in the last decades of the Byzantine Empire, are moving to Italy and often gaining employment by becoming teachers of Greek, right? So the stimulus of the Byzantine Empire on the Renaissance was very important. Not to be neglected either was its simple role as a bulwark against invasion, right? So you have Arab Islamic invasions, Avars, Bulgars, Slavic tribes, right, who are pouring into Europe from the east, and were the Byzantine Empire not there, the survival of the efforts to stabilize Western Europe, right, right, would be very much in question. So that's the first one. The second one is in terms of the development of Christianity, right, which obviously is one of the most important pillars of Western civilization, right? It's fair to say that most of the early and foundational intellectual work was done in the East, right? We sometimes forget that Christianity begins as an Eastern religion in many respects, with its great centers being places like Alexandria and Egypt. I should say sort of Greco-Hellenistic, the Hellenistic Middle East, right? So places like Alexandria and Egypt, with the Apostolic See of St. Mark, and Antioch and Jerusalem, of course, the Holy Land, and Constantinople, right? These became great centers of theological thought, and the fundamental dogmas of Christianity, which were being worked out, like the Trinity and the Incarnation. I mean, even with terms like the Nicene Creed, the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed, tell us something about the central importance of the East. Whereas Western church fathers, with the exception perhaps of St. Augustine, tended to be preachers and organizers and translators and administrators and this sort of thing. The theological, many of the most fundamental theological elements, right, were going on in Eastern Christianity. So that I think that's important to mention. The third thing that's important is the Orthodox cultures of today, which include Russia, as well as Greece and other parts of Eastern Europe, are essentially heirs of the Byzantine civilization, right? In the case of Greece, a sort of directly continuous or converted, right? Russia, for example, the Russian culture, for example, just as Constantinople thought of itself as the second Rome, with the fall of Constantinople, Russia came to think of itself as the third Rome, and in its political forms and self-conception inherited very much from the Byzantines. And a fourth would be in art history, right? I think that there's a great interest in the Byzantine art forms. And I mentioned Hagia Sophia and San Vitale in Ravenna, which are studied for their very distinctive forms of religious iconography and architecture. And so that's another area in which the Byzantines attract tremendous interest. So was there anything else you thought we should touch on, Miles, or any questions of that?
No, I mean, I'm sold on it. So I think you wanted to tell us a little bit about how all this hung together. In other words, what was the political order? What made up this eastern wing, basically, of the Roman Empire?
Yeah, so I think here's one of the very interesting things is that sort of the character of, although the same events affected both wings, as it were, of the Roman Empire, which was the conversion of this, one of the great turning points of history, right, would be the transformation of Christianity from this poor, persecuted sect, which won many of its early converts from slaves and the poor and the lower classes in Rome, right, and was a harshly persecuted sect, and how this became transformed into the imperial religion, the religion of the Roman Empire, right, and something which then suffused all aspects of European civilization. Certainly without any question, right, up until the Enlightenment and the French Revolution in that era, it had a virtual, the Christian world and the European world were more or less the same, and all that came as a result of the conversion of Constantine. But what's quite interesting is that the West and the East tended to look upon the relation of church and state somewhat differently, right? So if you think about, for example, Augustine's Civitas Dei, the city of God, right? Although he's certainly happy to have a Christian empire, he puts the Christian empire still very much in this Civitas Terrena, right? In the earthly city, right? The Christian still has to look beyond the earthly city entirely and have his primary loyalty to the city of God. And we should not expect sort of the complete Christianization of in other words, the reign of sin continues in the earthly sphere. And then you could look at some practical events like the efforts of the church to maintain its independence, right? So you have this great theme in the West of church and state, and sort of what we could call the creative tension between these two great institutions of the church and the empire. So St. Ambrose, under whom Augustine was baptized, excommunicates the emperor, the Christian emperor Theodosian, right? And Pope Gelasius will argue that the secular authority in religious matters is subordinate to the church, whereas the church is subordinate to the empire, to the state in civil matters, right? So we have this idea of a distinction between church and state. I mean, not at this stage in history like a modern non-establishment or separation, but the sense that these are two distinct functions, and that the church has an independent role within the Byzantine Empire. As I sort of alluded to, you have much more of the sense of a single society forming under the sacred monarchy of the empire, right? And we see this already with Eusebius. But Constantine, for example, is considered a saint in the Orthodox Church. We see this with Eusebius in the way in which he depicts Constantine as sort of this divinely chosen king in his life of Constantine. And I'll give you a little passage from Dawson in terms of how he describes this new Byzantine Empire. He says, "The new Christian empire of Byzantium is a parallel phenomena to the new Zoroastrian kingdom of Sasanian Persia. It also was a sacred monarchy based on the New World religion of Christianity. The Holy Roman Empire, Sancta Res Publica Romana, was the creation not of Charlemagne, but of Constantine and Theodosius. By the 5th century, it had become a veritable church state, and the emperor was a kind of priest king whose rule was regarded as the earthly counterpart and representative of the sovereignty of the divine word. Consequently, the power of the emperor is no longer disguised as it had been during the early empire, under the constitutional forms of republican magistracy. It is surrounded with all the religious prestige and ceremonial pomp of Oriental despotism. The ruler is the Orthodox and Apostolic Emperor. His court is the sacred palace. His property is the divine household. His edicts are the celestial commands. Even the annual assessment of the taxes is known as the divine delegation. And in case you think that this is, you know, sort of a Western Catholic looking askance at the at the East's sacred autocracy, we could say, Callistos Ware, who's a bishop, in his book on the Orthodox Church, calls the Byzantine Empire, he calls it the icon of the heavenly Jerusalem, right? So it's this idea of the earthly empire, the sacred empire, is going to be the imitation of the celestial court. One God in heaven, one emperor on earth, right? The earthly empire is the imitation of, the earthly monarchy is the imitation of the divine monarchy over the cosmos, right? So I think that this gives you a sense of sort of the style of the Byzantine mode of government. Now, the other thing that I should mention is that the emperor ruled through a civil service bureaucracy, right? So you have the questor of the sacred palace, who deals with laws and petitions and sort of a spokesman of the emperor, the master of offices, and the Byzantines were very famous for their diplomatic service. In some ways, our practices of diplomacy today arguably sort of spring from the Byzantines. I think even to this very day, we think of the Byzantines as sort of having this sort of complex, subtle, sophisticated diplomacy. The court of the sacred largesse and count of the private states, right, which deal with the treasuries of the emperor and revenues and expenditures and so forth. The Senate, the Byzantine Senate continued, you know, from the old Roman Senate. And then increasingly on the military level, the military was separated from the civil, but increasingly as the Byzantines are dealing with invasions from the north, from Slavic, Bulgar and Avar tribes, as well as the Islamic invasions, right? As it's under sort of continual siege, the empire becomes increasingly militarized. And in place of the old Roman provincial system, you have what were called the thems, each one governed by a strategos, or general. So it became increasingly a militarized empire, and was quite famed for its military prowess, and particularly, and this is also something which is not like the early Romans, the cataphracts, the cavalry of the Byzantine Empire. Right? I mean, when we think of old Rome, we think of the Roman foot soldier, the legionnaire, right? But when we think of the Byzantines, we should probably think you know, of the power afforded by the cavalry. So then we should mention the church as well, right? So you have the Patriarch of Constantinople at sort of the top of the pyramid, and again, so you have like this emperor who's sort of sitting above the civil and religious and military elements of the empire, and at the top of the pyramid is this figure of the emperor. So that's just a couple of things that I would mention about sort of the general style and forms of the Byzantine Empire. We'll look at how it developed in a moment, but did anything occur to you there, Miles, on this topic?
Well, I'm interested, as I think everyone watching is, to hear the kind of linear view from Constantine to Leo, so to speak. But one thing I'm thinking might be worth even just re-stressing is not necessarily a new point, but just revisiting this issue of the Oriental splendor, or, you know, the more regal, imperially centered model, as opposed to the Roman one. you made a few concise, punchy points about how it represents a real change in the nature of Christianity to go from a persecuted sect that lives in the underground to being, a ceremonially enshrined religion. That happens in the West, in Rome as well. But how did that change that the form of government? I mean, in terms of color or emphasis or tradition. For example, in Rome, we see the tradition of the emperors being made gods, or wearing the guise of certain conquering gods on certain ceremonial days. So there was a Roman state religion that some philosophers say really is a template that helps explain European DNA to this day. But of course, Rome had the memory of a republic which was lost. A certain senatorial tradition would see the empire, I guess, as at best a necessary evil. A republican spirit had been lost. Byzantium, in a sense, is formed without that direct lineage, or without that ancestry, despite the fact that it preserves, as you mentioned earlier, a Senate. So, is that difference meaningful or significant in the flavor of the eastern versus the western halves of the empire?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that'll bear on our next topic, because I think we'll see that some of these changes in the Roman Empire were already going on even before Constantine, right? Which can be argued to be sort of an orientalization of the empire itself. One that was to some degree cut short by the collapse of the Western Empire. We're going to see how republican forms had been vanishing. You could even, I think, make a case that in the 3rd century of Rome already, the classical civilization was dying. The old classical, that this was the century in which the old classical civilization kind of died, and the sort of new Christian imperial civilization grew from it, right? So what we could think of as sort of a decline and then a transformation, right? But why don't we go through some of these details so we can see how this process goes on?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah. So, like I said, so the 3rd century is really the century of crisis for the Roman Empire, right? What is going on? So first of all, you have pressure on the Roman borders from the barbarian tribes, which are and the Roman military is no longer the citizen soldiers of the old republic. It's now a professionalized military, which increasingly costly. Rome had hundreds of thousands of people in arms, and so this is causing economic strains. Then you have military coups, and the commanders, rather than being loyal to this concept of Rome, tend to be loyal to the commander that they know on the frontier. And they're fighting constant civil war. So Rome collapses into this kind of political chaos where might makes right. As a result of a lot of this chaos, you have the economic breakdown of trade, right? So whereas before you had the communicating of, goods moving, let's say, from Egypt to France, right along the Roman roads, what you have is sort of the collapse of the Roman trade economy. And economy tends to become local, indeed, often reduced to barter, as the currency is devalued by successive Roman emperors, right, who are looking for quick funds to pay off Roman debts or to fund various things. And so you have this collapse of the currency. Together with this, you have a dramatic de-urbanization, right? The cities, people start to flee the economic collapse and the political chaos and violence, right? That's besetting the empire. You have people fleeing the cities. What do? They go to the larger states, the latifundia, and become tenant farmers, right? And this gradually evolves into the manorial system of the Middle Ages, right? Where you have lands and serfs on the land, right? So you have an agrarianization of the Roman economy, and it becomes local. Localities become more and more self-sufficient, we could say, rather than getting involved in the trade economy, where you send something out in the midst of this chaos, you're not sure if it arrives where where it's supposed to go. You have plummeting birth rates, right? A demographic collapse. I mean, a truly dramatic demographic collapse from a combination of plagues and the violence and various social changes as well, possibly. You have the decline of literary culture, right? I mean, the third century does not produce very much in the way of it doesn't really meet the earlier standards set by Rome. And then you have the decline of the Roman religion, the old Roman religion. People are looking east into various sects and mystery cults that are coming in, whether it's the Mithraic mysteries or Manichaeanism, and we can put Christianity as well, right? I mean, there's kind of this new interest as Rome becomes increasingly, perhaps because Rome has become, the people of Rome become increasingly world weary as the world is coming apart. They're looking to secure immortality, and almost all of these sects promise in some way the continuance of life after death. But at any event, it means the decline of the old Roman religion. So this continues up until the pivotal Roman Emperor Diocletian, who comes to power in the year 284 AD. And he affects a complete transformation of the Roman Empire. In fact, we don't even call it, historians don't even call it by the same constitution, right? So the Augustan constitution was called the Principate, because Augustus called himself the princeps inter pares, right? The first among equals. And he preserved all the republican institutions, right? At least in principle, right? So the Senate continued, even the popular assemblies continued for a while, the executive magistracies continued, right? So Augustine thought of himself, or promoted himself, let's say, if one is cynical, as the conserver of the old Roman forms, right? So Diocletian sweeps away the relics of the old of the Roman Republic, essentially, right? The Senate is deprived of all effective power. And Diocletian is also very concerned about the separation, I mean, the role of the military, right? He thinks the military has become too powerful. So what he does is he basically separates the military entirely from a civil bureaucracy. And this is still going to continue through the Byzantine period, right? So many of these offices that I had mentioned had already begun with Diocletian. Now, the thing that this does also is that the emperor is able to affect his will through the bureaucracy without having to consult the military and the Senate, you see? So this is called the dominate. Rather than calling himself the princeps, he calls himself the dominus, the Lord, right? Court ritual, right? Asian style court ritual is brought into the Roman Empire, right? He dresses himself in purple silks, and people have to go prostrate before him, which was the Persian practice, which stimulated rebellions when Alexander the Great tried to introduce that Persian custom among the Greeks, right? Now he also, although he cuts the military out of power in the political sense, he also vastly bolsters the strength of the Roman military, the power of the Roman military, right? So he's trying to affect this restoration of, to halt the decline, let's say, of the Roman Empire. Now, very importantly, he establishes what's called the tetrarchy. So culturally speaking, the Western Latin-speaking part of the empire and the Greek-speaking East had always been separate and distinct. You had two distinct literary cultures. But what he does is he establishes the tetrarchy, meaning you have two emperors, one in the West and one in the East, to make administration easier. They're called the Augusti and the Caesari, right? The Augustuses and the Caesars, right? And so you have this beginning of a political division between the Western and the Eastern Empire. And also in the time of Diocletian, these social statuses like being a coloni at the Latifundians, they start to become more fixed and hereditary, because he wants assessment, right? If you're going to assess land, part of the productivity of the land is the workers that are on the land, and that has to be fixed, right? So he orders that. And then perhaps most famously, he inaugurates the last great persecution of Christianity, right? So he wants, as part of what he would see as this work of restoration, he wants to restore also the old Roman gods, right? And he feels that Christianity is weakening the sense of loyalty and patriotism, right? So one of the things that we should mention is the way in which the Romans, the old Romans, we could say, and the Christians conceived of church and state, right? So for the Romans, this idea of pietas, or the patriotism one owes to the gods, to the Roman gods, as well as to the Roman state, were more or less of a piece. The Roman gods were the protectors of the city, and they expected everyone in the emperor to offer sacrifice to the gods as a sign of their loyalty. Then they could worship whatever other gods they wanted in their own private time. If the Egyptians wanted to worship Isis, that's fine, but you're gonna offer some incense to Jupiter, right, to show that you're a loyal Roman citizen. Now, from the standpoint of the church, right, as it says in Philippians, our citizenship is in heaven, meaning that the only ultimate loyalty is to God, right, not to any earthly institution. And though they said that the Christian should obey the laws, right, they're essentially on pilgrimage, right? I mean, we're essentially in the world and not of it, and so there's no unqualified loyalty to earthly powers. And so the demand that the emperors or their gods be worshipped, right, violates God's law about idolatry, and therefore the Christians refused to do so. And so Diocletian endeavored to destroy the Christian religion. In the year 303, he issues 4 edicts calling for the destruction of all Christian churches. He prohibits the gathering of Christians for worship. He calls for the imprisonment of all Christian clerics, and Christians who refuse to offer sacrifice, clerics, are to be executed. So you have a huge number of hagiographies of saints from this period who, refused to renounce Christ, and you have this massive, great persecution. Christianity had not been a legal religion before Diocletian, and they were sporadic persecutions, but they were not sort of continuous, right? So this was really the last. I mean, these edicts were unevenly enforced, but Diocletian made it a priority to eliminate Christianity as a threat to the empire. Now he retires in the year 305. Well, maybe I should just stop there and just ask if you had any questions, or should I just go on?
No, it's a moment of great suspense, Alex. I would almost say at this point, at high drama, the main thing is to know what happens next.
Yeah, so Diocletian retires in the year 305, and Rome again goes into civil war, right? Between a Roman general, the two Roman higher-ups, Constantine and Maxentius. And according to the Eusebius's account before the battle at Milvian Bridge, right, Rome again having political struggles, who's going to be the emperor. And one of the contenders is Constantine. According to Eusebius's account, he sees a vision of a cross of light in the sky, and it says, en tuto nica, or in hoc signo vinces, is probably how most Westerners remember. In this sign, conquer. And so Constantine has his soldiers put the hero, right, for the first 2 letters of Christ's name on their standards, and he wins the battle, right? And so, and becomes emperor. And so here you have now, whereas just 6 years earlier, the very name of Christian was likely to get you killed, the very suspicion of being a Christian. Now suddenly Christianity was enjoying the imperial favor, right? It became the religion of the empire. And so I think we can divide, and Callistus Ware, the Orthodox bishop, right? I mean, divides his contributions or his importance, his historical significance, which is obviously is immense, right? I mean, the fact that Western civilization now becomes a Christian civilization is obviously of immense and long-lasting importance. He divides his immediate influence into three camps, right? Three elements, three fundamental things which Constantine does. So the first would be his edict of Milan, right, which legalizes the Christian religion, and this soon becomes de facto patronage, right, because he begins building churches, right, the Basilica of Martyrs, perhaps including many of the martyrs who had just been killed by his predecessor Diocletian. Now you have the Church of Martyrs built with imperial splendor on the tomb of Saint Peter, the Basilica of the Resurrection in the Holy Land, right? So many of the important shrines, right, was the origins of the Holy Sepulchre, right? So many of the important shrines of Christendom were already being built by under the patronage of Constantine, right? So the obvious thing is his conversion and patronage of Christianity, right? This is also going to over time influence the Roman legal codes, right? So you have the restriction of gladiator games and laws to protect orphans, and there's a gradual transformation of the Roman legal code to reflect Christian concepts, right? I mean, eventually Sunday is made into the day of rest, right? And Christian holidays become officialized and so forth, right? So we have this official sanction. Then the other thing that is important is, we'll discuss this more when we discuss religion and cultures, the Council of Nicaea, right? So we have the Arian controversy, which is about the status of Christ, right? And we can discuss the details later, but it's part of what it relates to Trinitarian theology and the relationship of the Father and Son. What's important for our point is that it's convoked by Constantine, the council. So the emperor and the losers, the Arians, get exiled. So what's important for our purposes is this precedent of the emperor as the guardian of Christian orthodoxy, right? Which becomes also a very important concept and remains throughout the history of the Byzantine Empire. And the third, of course, is his foundation of a new city, a Nova Roma, a new Rome in Constantinople, right? It was called Constantinople after his death, right? Whether one emphasizes, as some do, this idea of sort of starting anew with this new Christian city, right? Although there was a previous Byzantium before it, but he sort of rebuilds and makes it into this splendorous city with the Church of the Holy Apostles at the center, right? So this is the idea of this new Rome, or whether you emphasize the pragmatic things, that it was more easily defensible and further away from the barbarians who are going to shortly inundate the Roman Empire, right? For whatever reason, the city of Constantinople is going to be the core of the Byzantine Empire for the next 1,000 years plus, right? 12 centuries, or give or take. So those three things are hugely important. Now, then one of his successors, Theodosian, formalizes Christianity as the state religion in 395, and now the shoe is on the other foot. He starts closing down the pagan temples and so forth, right? So now paganism is not all, the old religion is not only, no longer on top, it's now positively on the bottom of the society. It's on its way out. And he's very important. Again, he issues a Theodosian code, which is again very important in this idea of the Christianization. Now, then what happens is the Huns. The Huns launch who are the Central Asian horse archer warriors, right, from the middle of Central Asia, rampage into Central Europe, where all these Germanic tribes are. And this starts what's called a Volkerswanderung, right, of massive movements of people. And to make a very long story short, because it's not really our topic today, this spells the death knell of the Western Empire, because you get Angles and Saxons moving into England. Eventually, you get the Franks moving into France. You get Visigoths coming to Spain, Ostrogoths coming to Italy, right? And this basically supplants the old Roman Empire. The last Roman emperor of the West is deposed in the year 476, and the barbarian warlord Odoacer offers his fealty or loyalty to the Eastern Empire. Oh yeah, I forgot to say, after Theodosian, the split becomes permanent. So you always, after Theodosius, get a Western emperor and an Eastern emperor. That was important to mention. He offers his fealty to Zeno, the Roman emperor of the East. So this event, from the standpoint of the people at the time, might not have seemed that weird. Depose one guy who was a figurehead by this time anyway, and pledge loyalty to the other Roman emperor. But in Western historiography, it brings an end to antiquity. It's the event that brings a close to the West Roman Empire. So I'll move on in a moment to sort of the continuation of the East Roman Empire. But I mean, we probably dealt with a lot with Diocletian and Constantine and so forth. So was there anything that came to your mind about that, Miles, that you wanted to discuss, or shall I go on to Justinian?
Unless you think that the invasion, for example, changes the direction that Byzantium is going in a way that can be summarized, I think it makes most sense just to follow the arc that you're describing.
Okay, yeah. So then let's just go forward then. So in the 6th century, you have the Emperor Justinian, who is again another one of these very pivotal figures. And he has a very colorful and much memorized court, which include the former courtesan, famous beauty of this late antique world or early medieval world, depending on how you want to look at it, Theodora, right, who becomes an influential member of his court. And he has a brilliant general named Belisarius. Okay, so the first thing is that his project is to reconstitute the Roman Empire, which has been taken over by the barbarians. So he wages wars on the Vandals, who had taken over North Africa and part of Spain. That's, by the way, where Andalusia comes from, or Al-Andalus, from Vandalusia. Just to let you know that little tidbit. Anyway, so he reestablishes rule over North Africa, moves into Italy. That's why you have the famous mosaics in Ravenna, which depict Belisarius and Theodora and the Emperor Justinian. And he reconquers part of Spain as well, right? So much of the empire which had fallen is restored to Eastern imperial rule under Justinian. Now it is Justinian who consecrates in the year 562 the Hagia Sophia, right, which is this sort of we could call it analogous to the St. Peter's Basilica, we could say, in Catholic Christianity, right? It's sort of the in Constantinople, right, in the heart of this Christian empire, you have the great church. As Dawson notes, liturgy is really kind of a centerpiece of the whole Byzantine worldview, right? So you can imagine the significance of that. You have a resurgence of trade in luxuries and various goods, right? So in some ways, it looks as though the empire is being sort of reconstituted. Perhaps his most enduring significance is, again, this corpus juris civilis, right? This codification of Roman law, right? Which is the last, like I mentioned, really Latin contribution of the Byzantines, which includes a codex codifying Roman laws, a digesta of traditional legal opinions, the Institutiones, which is a kind of manual for the teaching of jurisprudence, and the Novellae, which are the new laws promulgated by Justinian, right? And at this stage, the Christianization of the empire had pretty much gone apace. Now, another thing, I'd mentioned Constantine's role in sort of the guardianship of orthodoxy. One of the elements that we should mention was that Justinian was not a particularly religiously tolerant figure. So the school of the new academy, which was claimed to be sort of the continuation of the Platonic Academy, was closed in the year 529, and various heretical Christian groups which had been proclaimed heretical fled the Byzantine Empire and went to Persia, where they started translating works of classical philosophy, for example, into Persian, and that's how eventually you get the transmission of classical culture to Middle Eastern cultures, like we know about in the Islamic world, Avicenna and Averroes and so forth, right? So that's really an early conduit. Now the next, and Theodora, I should have mentioned. So we have a brilliant military commander. We have Theodora, who exercised great influence. In fact, stiffened his spine, Justinian's spine. He wanted to flee Constantinople during the Nika riots, which started, I think, from a sports hooliganism and turned into a political revolution. Essentially started like that, right? There were two different teams. I don't know the whole story, but anyway, they were spreading a lot of destruction, and he was thinking of fleeing the city. And Theodora kind of stiffened his spine and said, chin up, and sent the forces in to restore order and so forth. So there we go with that. Okay. So at this point, if you were a Byzantine living at the end of Justinian's reign, you would think things are going pretty well, right? I mean, he's reconstituted the empire in Italy and Spain and North Africa. It's become the mightiest force in the world, right? I mean, it would not be too hard to imagine that before long, the Byzantines might entirely reconstitute the Roman Empire, right? Given a few more emperors and some good military leadership, not entirely hard to imagine. But it was not to be. So then we have the Emperor Heraclius, right? Some of the things to mention about him are, one is he really fully Hellenizes this empire, right? So Latin basically disappears from imperial documents from his time onward, right? He's ruling early 7th century, right? I don't know, about 610 maybe, gets the power, something like that. And the other thing is the militarization that I mentioned of this empire sort of starts with Heraclius. Why? Because, like I mentioned, the Balkans provinces are now besieged by invaders, right? First the Avars, and then Slavic and Bulgar after him, right? Slavic and Bulgars, and he's also getting into huge wars with the Persians, right? So in early in his reign, you have the Persians invade the provinces of Syria, Anatolia, Palestine, and Egypt, and they take the relics of the cross. And this leads to, I don't know, like about a 20-year war between the Persian and the Byzantine empires, which ends with Heraclius returning in triumph with the relics of the true cross, right? So this is at this point a celebrated leader. But a new force was rising in the south from an unexpected source. We have what became the great monotheistic rival of Christianity, of Islam. Muhammad had unified Arabia by the end of 632. And in the year 636, Arabia was kind of a backwater. I mean, it had been largely ignored by the Greeks and Romans, right? It was this desert region. Nobody was expecting much to come of it. if it had, the Persians and Byzantines probably would not have exhausted themselves fighting each other, right? But this new force emerged. But one of the most decisive battles in history, which Dawson calls the answer of the East to the challenge of Alexander, right? If you think of Alexander as kind of spreading the Greek civilization eastward, right? Islam is kind of pushing the other way. So what happens? In the year 636, you have this battle between the Emperor Heraclius's forces and an Islamic army on the borders of what is today Syria, Israel, and Jordan. And the Byzantine armies are decisively defeated, right? Which opens all of these provinces in the Eastern Mediterranean to Islam. Then a few years later, in the year 642, Alexandria, the center of the Greco-Egyptian civilization, falls to Islam, and that now opens the whole Mediterranean, right? So now the Islamic forces can sweep straight across North Africa, and eventually, in fact, they reached Spain and so forth, right? So I don't know, roughly 2/3 of the Byzantine Empire came under Islamic rule within a few years of its ascent. So it was a very lightning fast, really set of conquests, and from then on, right? I mean, the immediate successors, the Heraclian line is mostly just trying to survive at this stage. Mostly just because they're under continuous attacks, right? The Greek islands come under attack, and by the 680s, right, under one of Heraclius's successors, you have the first siege of Constantinople by Islamic forces, and there were also Avar and Bulgar attacks, right? So basically, the Byzantine Empire has been reduced basically to Greece and Anatolia, and is under continuous attack. So you could imagine why this militarization of the government takes place. Okay, the last group of figures that I would want to discuss would be the Isaurian dynasty. So Isaurus is a region in northern Syria, which is where he was from. And the year 717, he takes power in a palace coup, we could say, I guess. Two important things about Leo. One is he successfully saves Constantinople from the second siege, Arab siege. In the year, for a full year, 717 to 1718, the Arabs are besieging Constantinople. And if it had fallen, history might be quite different, right? So the fact that he withstood this siege using Greek fire, and which was this explosive, right, and other means, meant that very likely the developing, redeveloping Western civilization, Latin civilization, had much more time because, right, probably, in other words, Leo is as significant as Charles Martel, who stopped the Islamic invasion in northern France in the year 732 after they had conquered Spain. That's one thing. The other thing is he begins this iconoclasm, right? So you have a very long iconoclastic controversy that doesn't get fully resolved until over 100 years later, really, right? So beginning about 725, 726, he begins a campaign against the icons. And it's very characteristic. It's very characteristic of the Byzantines that theological issues had utmost political significance. Why exactly the iconoclastic, the issue? Iconoclasm meant the destruction of the forbidding of sacred images, right? So it was very natural to Greeks and Romans in their religious works to want to depict the gods, right, in terms of visual arts. It was not as natural in the, if you look, for example, in the Old Testament, right, there's a prohibition on graven images, right, the idea that God should not be depicted. And so you had an association of idolatry, and iconoclasm has periodically resurged. It was an important element in Islam, right? So much of Islamic art is abstract, right? Especially in the Arab part of the Islamic world. You don't see a lot of depictions of human imagery or animal imagery. And you had episodes of Protestant iconoclasm, like they're under the Puritans, right? So it's been a theme. So we have this inner tension. What spurred it? There's a lot of debates. Okay, so one thing seems to be Leo was wondering why, since we're God's empire, right? Since we're the true Christian empire, why did we just lose 2/3 of our territory, right? And so the idea is that it must be some form of impiety, and maybe it's our veneration of images, right, that caused it. So that's one element. Dawson talks about also this tension of Eastern and Western elements within the empire. So he notes that iconoclasm tended to be supported in the Eastern provinces and opposed in the Western provinces, right? So there might be a tension also between the sort of Hellenic tradition of using visual art versus some of the tendencies of the East, and perhaps some even argue some Islamic influence as well. Pushing for this idea that God should not be depicted, God and divine images should not be depicted. And it was opposed by the monks, right? So who became an important political players, were for long important political players in the Byzantine empires, and opposed also by the popes, who just thought the whole thing was ridiculous and condemned the iconoclasm of the Byzantine emperors. And so you had this huge religio-political clash between the iconodules, those who wanted to offer dulia or worship or honor to venerate the icons, and the iconoclasts, right, who were largely supported by the Isaurian emperors. And so while they're waging these wars, and gradually the successors of Leo are expanding, you're having this inner conflict. This was to some degree, you had an ecumenical council, which we can discuss a little bit later, which condemned iconoclasm in the year 787. Eventually, you had the Empress Irene, the last member of the line of the Isaurians, who was herself an iconodule. So she kind of ends this first great outbreak of iconoclasm. And as we know to this day, icons are very strongly venerated in the Orthodox Church. So iconography becomes a very important part of Byzantine and Orthodox art work in general. But we can sort of, with that sort of discussion of a theological political dispute, we can maybe have a little bit of transition to what we'll discuss next time. So was there anything in that sort of historical overview you wanted to discuss or bring up, Miles?
No, I mean, nothing to add, really. We've covered a lot of space and time. And two of the things that jump out at me listening from a student's perspective are this is an empire with an uncommonly strong sense of mission, or almost a kind of cosmology, right? Which anchored its worldly view in a celestial or divine vision. So that's one thing. The other is the extraordinary complexity of its geographical situation and its adversities. So it seemed like an empire that had to do an enormous amount of triangulation in the development and sustaining of its grand strategy, right? And cultivating not just culture, which reached into the Roman Empire and the Hellenic world and the emerging codified Christian culture, but into military genius and famous figures like Belisarius, who are still known to this day. So that's sort of my gloss. And in a second, maybe you can add anything to that if you want, but I guess I want to remember to extend a sort of twofold invitation to everyone. One is to stay tuned and stay tense. We'll be revisiting the sort of second half of the Byzantine story in another video. You can also check out our other videos on this channel. And if you want to delve into anything more substantially, Alex, they should contact you to find out about becoming students enrolled in one of our courses.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and so I put my email address on the YouTube video, so you can just reach out to me if you're interested in learning more about our courses. As far as their grand strategy and diplomacy, I kind of think of Machiavelli discusses the fox and the lion, right? So what you always see with the Byzantines is that they undertake very subtle diplomatic missions, right? So they were for example, while they are fighting the Arabs, they're making sure to be extending diplomatic courtesies to the Bulgars, right? so that they're not fighting two-front wars and that sort of thing. And of course, their religious mission was also part of it, because ultimately the Eastern, the Byzantines converted many of the Slavic peoples. I mean, Russia would be one of the big coup, I suppose. Right. Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, so they were converting people, as which was also obviously, it's obviously better. There was a tendency, obviously, when they adopted the Byzantine religion, to also be allies, right? So there was an element of the fox of using diplomacy, but they also had a legendarily powerful military, right? That people didn't really want to face. So those two elements, I think, were probably the secret to their long survival. So, I mean, when we think about the fact that they were under siege and barely, it was iffy whether they would even survive when Leo took over, right? And Constantinople is under siege, but yet they lasted till 1453. So that tells you something about the stick-to-itiveness of the culture.
Yeah.
So does that cover it?
It baits the hook for next time. So I think we're looking forward to it.
Absolutely. Take care, everyone.
See you next time.
See you.